Welcome to AgencyRise, the podcast where digital marketing agencies rise together. I'm your host, Chris Rudolph. I've spent the last decade coaching digital agency founders, helping them scale systemized operations and break free from the day-to-day grind. On this podcast, we talk about what really moves the needle for agencies: getting clients, building a team, creating systems, productivity, focus, and freedom. So no hype here, no guru nonsense, just real conversations from the agency trenches. So today's guest is Leah Leaves, founder and CEO of Elderon Operations Solutions. Elderon is a go-to fractional operations partner for remote agencies. So she helps founders stop being the bottleneck and start being the CEO by bringing in operation leaders and project managers that they're missing. So Leah, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be on your show.
For those that may not be familiar with you, tell us more about you and your business.
Yeah, so I've been in the agency space for more years than I care to share out loud. It's been a long, long time. And most of those have been really at the subsection, of operations. And most agency owners, may not have that well defined for themselves, but really how we define it is it's interconnecting all of the systems that it takes to run your agency. So yes, that includes, the back of the house, like HR and recruiting and finance and admin, but it also, is discussing, the front of the house, where you have project and account management, you have client strategy, you have your growth engine of your marketing and sales, and so operations is really how it all interconnects, and works seamlessly together. So I really love this space, because most agencies, most agency owners, did not get into business, for being a business owner, being, in operations, they got into it because they truly are passionate about the marketing and the advertising strategy, that they came from, from whatever background, they started with for it. And so most of them that we've worked with, are just so darn good at what they do. It just kept attracting more and more business and they kept growing with it. And then all of a sudden they wake up and they're an agency owner. It's like, oh gosh, how did I get here? And that's when we start seeing the cracks, in the agency because they've really built in most dependencies on them, unfortunately. So this could be from delivery, obviously through operations like day-to-day management, and then of course, in sales and marketing. So we really work with them and strategize with them to get them out of those seats, that are not best suited for their unique strengths, so that they can get back to what they really love to do. They could be the chief strategy officer, could be the CEO, just the owner. It really depends on, what they're looking for, as an individual. And I just love working, with visionaries, like that have such a clear purpose, and then we can help support them in that realizing of their vision.
Yeah, I love that, Leah. I think you nailed it as far as nearly every agency founder I talked to was almost an accidental business, or it wasn't something that they had a 10-year plan to enter. They are not typically not natural project managers. I can think of maybe some that on like one hand of people that are natural, like operations minded and skilled. That tends to be a big time need within their agencies. So I'm excited to dive into like the intricacies of that. And so like, how do you know, like if for all the agency founders out there, how do we know that like operations might be an issue? Like how we're currently doing operations might be an issue.
Yeah. So the biggest reason that, or the biggest way that we'll hear, from agency founders that operations is an issue is because they are repeating for themselves, you know, they are underwater, they are drowning, in the busy work, that they don't have any time or space to think clearly and they're really starting to burn out, and then the way that we can tell, especially that their operations isn't working for their team, is you'll hear often the refrain from team members where they'll say things like, oh, I didn't know that, or, oh, that wasn't ever shared with me, and there are systematic failures throughout the business that are happening because most agency founders, when they get started, they're relying on a lot of one-on-ones, a lot of word of mouth, with their coworkers, and they're often trying to rely on a very flat structure. And this is legit. Like we've seen this, from many an agency owner where if they've come from like a corporate burnout, background, then they're really hesitant to layer in management, and oversight and systems. But we try and break through that to help them understand, the infrastructure that is needed, is exactly that. It's infrastructure. It's not meant to be red tape. And
Mm,
so the
good.
reason why it's so important to have solid infrastructure is because it leads directly to all the outcomes that the owner got into business for in the first place. Like great client retention because they have the best relationships and they have eager clients, who want to keep working with them, and they're doing good work, for the clients. It also contributes directly to the bottom line. To be honest, we're in business, for reasons, that we can do our best work, we can get paid, what our value is, and we can balance that with the lifestyle that we're looking to have. And so in those cases, that's where the operational infrastructure directly benefits the owner. When we do have systems and processes and tools and platforms and training and management, and they may be scared of some of those words, but it all contributes to the bigger picture, of helping them to realize, their goals. So we can often hear those fractures, in the business, those stress fractures, by often, those refrains of, I didn't know that. Oh, I'm really frustrated by this, or, also the client retention is starting to drop and you just don't know why because the team is actually doing good work. Oh, so there are a lot of like small issues that start to really build, toward, an agency, owner that's getting really upset, with the direction of the agency.
Yeah. So if the agency founders are experiencing some of those things and they're like, okay, what do I do next? Do I hire someone? Do I, like an employee? Do I hire someone fractionally? Or, like a lot of times now with where AI is going, is there something that I can set up agents or are there tools that can do it for me? Like maybe just walk us through like some of the, yeah, like the typical paths that you see
Yeah.
that have worked well.
Well, the short answer is yes to all of that. Like, yes, you can do all of that and it will dramatically, help. But before you hire anyone or start building anything, the first step that we always take, our own clients through and that we recommend even agency founders that, are interested in doing this on their own is first, go through what we call, our founder capacity scan. And so what essentially that breaks down to is sit down with a piece of paper. I'm talking analog here. We're saying go simple, and write down the organizational chart of your agency as it stands today. And for every agency, we start with a very, very simple structure of from left to right. On the left side, you've got your growth engine. So you've got marketing and sales. And then in the center, you've got your operations backbone, right? So HR, finance, admin, recruiting, all those internal bits and bobs. And then on the right side is your client delivery, fulfillment, service, whatever title you might term it. And then if you have product, add that in, to delivery as well. So you have these three pillars of the organizational chart, and then just real quick sketch down all of the different functions within each of those buckets and put the name of the person who owns the outcomes,
Mm,
right? And I can guarantee you, in just about any agency, no matter what size, like if you're 3 people, you're 30 people, sometimes we've seen it even at 300 people, that the agency owner's name will show up in more than 80% of those seats still. And
wow.
it's sobering, to see that, and it's because we're really talking about who owns the outcome of it, not who's doing the day-to-day work. Because you may have actual team members, or you may have, even if you've already built it, an AI agent, to actually fulfill some of the responsibilities. But at the end of the day, if somebody had a question, if something broke down, if a client, was like, hey, who's responsible for this? And it escalates, does it come back to you, the owner? Almost always. And that's the first step is you've just got to map out what the situation really is in reality before you jump into straight hiring or building the next AI tool or whatnot. Because you just need to know the lay of the land. You need to have a plan. You need to have a strategy. And so often how we walk our own clients through it is once we've gone through, that scan and very quickly, can determine, okay, you're in 20 of 25 seats here. Well, almost always we're going to start on that right-hand side and the delivery side and start chipping away. And
Mm,
we've got to get you out of delivery and execution first. Then we can focus on the ops component and the leadership, of that. And then one of the hardest areas that we've seen, for most agency founders to really hand off successfully, to another owner is marketing and sales. And some of that is just because they've built up the brand as them, rather than as, a separate entity, like a business entity. So that's a little bit more complex. It might take a little bit longer. But if you go through this 3-step plan, then you can effectively chip your way out of so many seats, and maybe you're at the end, of the day, quote unquote, you may be in 3 instead of 20, of those 25 seats. And so there's a lot of opportunity to get clever with it, and creative. So there are opportunities that we're seeing more so than ever before, obviously with AI, that you don't have to go out and hire an individual right away. You may be able to supplement some of the execution work, let's say in delivery, with AI first. If you have a couple of other team members already that can oversee that can manage it, that can create the right prompts, do the right QA and QC or quality assurance and quality control work, and then really be able to take over the outcomes. I'll be honest though, there are still roles that we are 100% recommending are still human right now. And human, being in early 2026, because it may change in the future,
Mhm.
but particularly the management and the strategy roles. If you can take all of your efforts and your extra budget that you might have and invest into those roles and into top tier, high level talent, that will dramatically support you getting out of so many of those seats. Like you could get out of 5 seats at one time with one hire, like one
Mm.
key strategic hire. So it does take a little bit of chess work, where you need to be intentional, about the strategy that you're going through. But at the very least, just start with that exercise, get it on out of your head and onto paper. And I can guarantee you'll start seeing viscerally, like what roles, what seats you need to get out of first. And that'll give you at least the starting line, the starting direction. Then we can talk about, is it AI? Is it fractional? Is it a contractor? Is it full time, in house, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you said that, Leah. I've been seeing this theme come up in conversations I've had, now that AI isn't like the new kid on the block. It's growing, and the things that are being done, even more powerful. But I'm seeing a trend that I'm hearing coming from the agency world. It's like human directed or human led, but AI assisted. At least now, I know like we don't know what the future is going to be, but I agree with you there. That I think there has to be someone who is leading or directing that doesn't have to like do everything, but is big. And I liked how as an agency founder, you come with like you're frustrated when a lot of those things you were talking about earlier start to come up. You're seeing the fractures in different parts of your organization or delivery or retention, employee complaints, whatever it might be. And it can be overwhelming, but I love how you really like the scan of like assessing, okay, what is actually happening? What's the reality? It's like data. It brings like balance to like the emotion that you have. Like so you can make good decisions.
And that's the best way, to bottle it up as well, is that it takes all of this emotional baggage that we all have, genuinely, especially as an owner, as a business owner, right? Like you're so emotionally wrapped up in the success, of your customers, and your team. You want to see them do well. You want to make sure that the brand is well respected as well. And so it's really important, to each individual, owner that we work with and that, I've had the pleasure of networking with over many years, in the industry. Genuinely, agency owners care. They care a whole heck of a lot, and so it's important, to then balance that and bottle that up, by again taking it out of your head and onto paper and just making it a little bit more objective. Because then once you have that data, now you can think more clearly. Because again, we hear from a lot of agency owners that like that's one of their biggest issues is that they just don't have the white space in their calendar to think clearly because they're jumping from, oh, this client engagement and then that client escalation. And then we had this issue with this vendor and how are we billing, our clients in the first place? And when are we having to pay our people? And they're context switching 100 times, within the day. And we all know like how much that can drain, your personal energy, let alone, your professional capacity to be a true
Mm,
leader. So it's really important, where you can take control, of the objective view, and again, get it out of your head and onto paper, like that's a great place to start because then it gives you just like that quick breath of fresh air. You can say, I see it. I get it. And I know what to do next. Because even if it's just the next step is, oh, I know who I need to go to ask help for. So it may not be that, oh, you need to solve it. It may not be that, oh, you need to be the one to complete that task, as we use like often like the Eisenhower matrix with owners when we're talking about like, okay, what are all the details that you're doing, all the tasks? And one of those buckets, is what can I just delete or delegate entirely?
mm.
Yeah. And so when you do an exercise like that, and this is why I still like doing it on paper, is because it gives you just a little bit more of that control. And I think that's what a lot of agency owners need, is because they're feeling out of control in
Oh
so
yeah,
much of the
for
day
sure.
to day, that like just a little bit back into the control factor for them, like it can really help just regulate their emotional state.
Yeah. No, that is super. I'm thinking too, like as a founder, you're looking at, okay, you're probably surprised how many of those roles your name is, like you're the owner of. And I know that can be overwhelming. And I know it's rare in just how agency, like how your agency evolves is the reality is you're probably not able, if let's say you have your name on 10 roles, you're not able to hire 8 roles at once or 5 roles at once, but I like how you had the systematic approach of, like, maybe, like, the lowest hanging fruit or, that start with delivery. I think that making it systematic as they gain more freedom, I know I see, like, that's where, like, growth happens. Like, let's say if a founder is, like, they're really good at their own marketing and sales, but they're spending, like, 5% of their day on it because 'cause they're doing all the other stuff, like, you give them another 5 or 10%, and that's when like things happen and they can grow, and I can see then you have the finances to take the next step. So I really like how you put that
Exactly.
together.
Yeah. Well, and it's a great point because that's when they can actually see the needle move. And you're right that it can take, just 5% extra, 10% extra. It doesn't have to be this overhaul overnight that everything changes because actually most agencies, that's not a sustainable method, of change management, which it sounds really complicated, but essentially, it's saying, you know, you can't scale, if you're constantly moving the goalpost, across the entire organization. So when you're doing 1% change here, 5% change there, and systematically, kind of chipping away at it, over time, everything compounds. So as long as you're doing those small changes, positive along the way, it will continue to move that needle. And like you said, you'll see it, in the bottom line. You'll see it also in one particular metric that we like a lot of our agency owners to track that not a lot of them do is their actual team churn rate. And
Mm,
so how frequently is their team changing? Not just their client churn, because a lot of agencies, might focus on client retention, client churn, client satisfaction, but it's really important to do similar metrics, for tracking internally with your team because that can also reflect back on how well are the changes that you're making going over because
mm.
the more that you systematically are getting yourself out of the weeds and improving, holistically the infrastructure of the business, your team will stay much much longer with you, and you'll have lower rates of team churn which increases client retention, we know directly.
Yeah, that's really good. So what I've heard this and I can imagine this is pretty common as okay, now there's a need for operations and people to own a lot of those things that typically I see founders aren't very good at or that's not like their area of expertise or where they should be spending their time on. So they see the need and it can be tempting to like just think, well, someone on, look just at their team and like who could take this on, but maybe doesn't have the background or experience. Maybe like share some wisdom of like how to approach those type of situations.
Yeah, I'm honestly a huge fan in both personal and professional capacities. Hire the expert, right?
Mhm.
Just pull the trigger, hire the expert. And the reason being is that more often than not, when a lot of agency owners look internally to their other team members, of like, oh, you could just take on one more thing. And most often, if they present it, to the team member feels obligated.
Mm.
They feel like they have to say yes because the owner is asking them directly. And so they may put themselves in a situation that they're not set up for success for, and that you haven't set them up for success for, because you're just asking them kind of for a favor. So we see this often, where agency owners start to muddy the waters with roles and responsibilities because they just keep adding and adding and adding, for their team members. And there may be individuals that could take on, certain projects or certain responsibilities. But then I think you need to look at the equal and opposite of what do you need to subtract from their responsibilities? Who do you need to have support them, in order that they can do the next thing really well? Or do you need to bring in a coach, specifically to help elevate that team member to do it to the best of their ability? So it takes actually quite a lot of work and a lot of nuance to elevate a team member internally to a lot of these different roles that the owner needs to get out of, unless it's somebody that is a clear pathway, in their career direction, and you've been having these conversations with them, and they can be a part of developing that as its own role, and have a very clear set of responsibilities. But we just don't see that very often, especially in smaller agencies, that are under typically like 5 million annual revenue. Like, they just don't have the know-how to do that either. Like, they've not been in a lot of manager positions, director
Mhm.
positions themselves as owners. And so they may not have the skill set to effectively transfer responsibilities, from themselves to team members. So we often will say, like, yeah, just hire the expert, get that fractional professional in there, and have them help build that infrastructure that is needed for that role. Have them help set the expectations of the role and the responsibilities and their accountabilities and the success metrics, because they know it best. They've been in it, before, and multiple times, and so it's really important that they come in, hit the ground running. And what they can do with building out that system for you is that as the capacity, continues to grow for that particular function, that system now is ready for you to potentially replace them with a full-time hire or another asset. So I'm very biased on this because I'm a huge proponent of flexible and fractional, workers. I think that, especially, with being a remote worker myself, my whole career, I've found the benefits, vastly outweigh, the potential, drawbacks to it. And so I think there are a lot of individuals that have incredible experience, incredible skill sets. And if you can bring them in, without all the overhead, right, of bringing in like a full time employee. So you bring them in, get them settled, have them hit the ground running, get the work done, as well as have them build the system and the infrastructure to then be sustainable, so that if you do need, to bring it in, in house, or full time, it's set up and you didn't have to build it. So like
Yeah,
that's so important for agency owners. It doesn't have to be all on them to figure it all out and create all the solutions and architect, all these different roles and responsibilities, most that they don't have personal experience with. Most agency owners, for example, don't have a lot of business operations acumen, where they're coming with a background from like finance, HR, recruiting, so it's okay. You don't have to know all those things. And that means you also don't have to build those things. You can hire the expert to build it for you, and then you have the opportunity, to make sure the team is set up correctly for long-term sustainable success.
that's good. I always like, personally, I'm like, what systems can I invest in or buy that can be plugged in and like I don't have to build it if that's not my area of expertise. And I know it's been several different roles that I've seen agency founders where just when you can bring in someone who can create the system, it like completely takes the overwhelm off, the burden, because it's not only a financial investment, but they also think of the time and like, okay, now I gotta find time. I already don't have time. I'm already like feeling the stress. And then I have to like try to figure out all the systems and then train this person in there. And that's not in my that's not in my wheelhouse, so I don't have the time or the expertise. So I love what you said about that. And then also I think a lot of times when you think of, okay, I need to bring in a leader in ops, and you think about how much you would have to pay to get someone really solid full time. And I know that's a big jump. And even that jump, is like you almost need the fractional help or the help to get systems to be able to get to the place where you could even afford that. So I love that you brought up the fractional piece as well.
Yeah, I think it's a huge value add, for agency owners, to consider. Like you said, definitely because of their own time investment, that they can offset, with a fractional leader. And this goes, for other contract roles as well. I mean, think of it, even as simply with like your bookkeeper. Most agency owners should not be reconciling their monthly statements. And yet we still see many an agency owner doing that, because they honestly just don't know how to, hire for that particular function, or they are concerned, about is somebody else going to do it right instead of continuing to let it be a time suck, and an energy suck, where they're still doing it themselves and it is way below their pay grade. It can be as simple as asking other agency owners, hey, who do you use, for bookkeeping, and would you recommend them, or finding, online, like you could easily search, in, for example, LinkedIn, fractional bookkeeping services, and I always add the addendum of like for agencies, because it's always better to
Mhm.
have somebody that's more of an agency specific service provider,
Exactly.
knows the industry quite well. But like that's one of those simple things, that not every agency owner thinks about. And that's again another one of those seats that's on the org chart that
Mhm.
we have them write down and show them like, are you still doing your bookkeeping? Are you still doing your taxes? Are you still being the individual that pays all the bills or pays all of your team members? So accounts receivables and accounts payables, right? Like those types of activities are responsibilities, that a fractional individual, could handle, and we're in a state, of the environment, and the economy, where there are incredible fractional professionals for each one of those segments. So you
Mhm.
can have a fractional financial professional, you can have a fractional operations leader, you can have a fractional, project, and fulfillment lead. So it's really open ended, of what you can fill with the right fractional provider. And there's so many that are agency specific today as well, which is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, that's good. So we're going to move into our rapid fire round. So I'm going to fire off a question and you can fire off an answer. So, what's one tool or piece of software that makes you more efficient?
If I had to narrow it down to one right now, actually, it would be a new tool that I've just started using called Rise, Rize, which is an automated time tracking tool. And
Okay.
it's kind of like it's a big productivity hack, I think, for any owner in particular to use. I mean, absolutely, it's incredible for your team, but definitely for an owner to find out where you're really spending your time online, it's huge. And I've used all kinds of time tracking tools, but this one is pretty legit.
Good tip. What's one daily habit you swear by? It could be personal or business related.
Ooh, so one that I still swear by is my morning ritual. So I still get up at 5:30 every morning, go through. I have a bit of a regimented, beginning to the day, but it's incredibly supportive, for starting the day off right. I'm going through my yoga flow and meditation and prayer and journaling and breakfast and time with my husband, and family. Yeah, and it gives me the space in the morning to really prepare myself, for the day ahead rather than like just jumping into like social media or email or something like that. So having those couple of hours in the morning just to do that is so crucial, and it's served me for a long time.
I love that. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm there with you. That's huge. What's one book or mentor that has really impacted you?
Well, I've had so many, but I'd say the one that I keep coming back to, especially recently, is a book by Dan Martell called "Buy Back Your Time," and it's something that I've tried to apply both personally and professionally. I'm still working on my husband with it a little bit, but it's definitely an incredible book with great practical tools that I can implement, day in and day out.
And what's one final piece of advice that you give agency founders who are listening right now?
Get help. I mean, in a nutshell, I would say get help. I know how many agency owners are still out there sticking it out on their own, trying to figure it out, behind the scenes, not trying to show honestly any weakness or vulnerability, and I want them to know, that it is not weak. It's I just get so animated about it because, we all are here, meaning in the agency industry, to help one another. And like I said, how much I know agency owners care about their own customers. Like I know how much each other service providers, and other agency owners care about each other in this industry. And everybody is willing to help. Everybody is willing to lend an ear, a recommendation, a referral, you name it. So the biggest thing is just ask and get help.
I love that. And where's the best place online to learn more about you and your services?
Yeah, I'd say two main places. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. Just under my name, Leah Leaves, and then our website, alderonenterprise.com. We've got some free tools there, and we'll have some more information about us. But those are kind of the two main areas that I hang out.
Awesome. Well, Leah, this has been great. Thanks for sharing all the insights into a piece that I think is really neglected, like the operations piece and what a burden it is to founders. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. This was such a pleasure.
And for everyone tuning in from the gym, in your car, or at your desk, thanks for joining us. And if this episode was helpful for you, be sure to subscribe and share it with another agency founder who could benefit from it. Because agencies don't rise alone, they rise together. This is Agency Rise.